What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the Chasing Clarity Health and Fitness Podcast. This is your host, Brandon DeCruz, and on today's episode of the Chasing Clarity Podcast, I have our most requested return guest, Doctor and new WNBF Pro, Eric Helms, back on the show. Eric, thank you so much for joining me this morning, and congrats again on earning your pro card status, my man. That was well-deserved, not only, but also a long time coming. So I'm truly, really happy to hear that and see that you get that honor, but also I know that it's something that means, a lot to you.
Yeah, dude, it's something I've been working towards, and I think at my core, I'm still just a bodybuilder who has, my own athletic aspirations. So it was a very cool moment and something I worked very hard for, and I really appreciate the acknowledgement. And I'm honored to hear that I'm requested and people want me back on. So I'm happy to be back always.
Yeah, not to divulge too much of the stats, but I will say that you were our number one guest in 2023. So I will say that you have had actually our number one and number two most not most requested, but most downloaded episodes. So we've done a good job. And actually, funny enough, this is actually the 1 year anniversary of the last time, not the last time we did a podcast, because we did do one in August when you were mid-season. However, we
That's
did
right.
one the first week of February in 2023. So it was right before you started your contest prep. So we had done a little synopsis of the calf stretching,
Hmm.
thing that you were doing, the experimental design that you were doing, and we had kind of alluded to the fact that you'd be competing then in the summer. We gave an update on that, so now we've kind of wrapped it, all full circle in terms of you not only completing the season, but at this point you are a pro, and now you're looking towards, eventually going into not your first pro season, but your full, I guess, full
First pro
season in
off
terms.
season.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely, great way to put it.
Yeah.
All right,
Yeah,
so
man.
before we get into today's topic, we're going to be talking about energy intake and muscle gain and the rate of weight gain and muscle gain. I do want to give a bit of a background as to why I asked Eric on the podcast, just for everyone out there. And so, as most of the listeners of this podcast will know, I recently did a presentation for a charity seminar on the topic of nutrition for maximizing muscle growth. And when I was reviewing the list of citations that I used to build out that presentation, I actually realized that you, Eric, you were the individual who was on the most amount of papers. So you weren't the head author, but you were on, I mean, we're talking Roberts et al. 2020. We're talking Slater et al. 2019. Obviously, I included your recent study that we're going to go through in detail today. I mean, there were so many studies, Iraqi et al. 2019. I mean, there's so many that you've been on. And so I honestly couldn't have thought of a better guest and a person to dig into this topic than you yourself. So I'm honored to have you on. But I think when we get into the topic, before we get into your actual study, I would like to go through some of the data in terms of what we knew up until this point, because you recently had a study that was released and officially published at the end of 2023. But I believe it's safe to say that, based both on like the body of evidence that we have, and also I'll just say from my own experience coaching, we know that an energy surplus is not necessary to gain muscle, as I think. And we have a ton of examples in the literature and then in real life where individuals can recomp, so they're gaining muscle, or some muscle at least, while losing some body fat. But when we talk about nutrition for maximizing muscle gain, and the emphasis on maximizing, um, you know, I do believe that to maximize our ability to gain muscle as an intermediate and especially as an advanced trainee, one thing we do need to ensure is that we're out of an energy deficit. So, to start this topic off, Eric, I'd love to hear your thoughts on whether an energy surplus is beneficial for maximizing muscle hypertrophy, and why we'd want to avoid being in an energy deficit when our goal is to maximize our rate of muscle growth. Because you are on a paper by Slater, which is probably the best deep dive into this topic as a whole. And we do have some other data that looks at the impact of being in an energy deficit as compared to either at maintenance or in a surplus. And a lot of people will look at just the recomp data and say, all right, well, we know that we can build muscle in a deficit. But when we're talking about maximizing muscle gain, especially in the context of, the average listener of the show that's an intermediate trainee, they have years under their belt, and they're looking for just getting that extra little rate of gain, is it conducive to be an energy surplus, or can we maximize that in a deficit?
Great question. I like the way you frame that. And I think the two pieces of research that are really useful for this, or papers, I should say, is the paper that Slater led that he asked me to be a part of 2019, is an energy surplus required to maximize muscle hypertrophy associated with resistance training, where we talked about all of the ways that building muscle requires, thinking about energy intake, from the energy you burn actually training
Mhm.
to the theoretical cost of actually building tissue through fueling muscle protein synthesis to the increase that you might not anticipate in NEAT that defending against your current weight to try to prevent further weight gain. Um, and how that is sometimes much higher in certain individuals than others, where you have to disproportionately increase your energy intake to get actually into a surplus because of this. And then looking at all the evidence of, okay, well, do we see benefits of being in a surplus when people are, trying to put on muscle mass? And the the closest we could get in that study by Slater and colleagues is, or that review in Slater and colleagues was there are downsides to a deficit. And you definitely want to be at least in maintenance. But you absolutely can build muscle, and it may be better doing that in some type of surplus, and the amount of the surplus should be an appropriate amount based on your goals, like to mitigate excess fat gain, and then to try to optimize the rate of muscle you can gain given your goals. And that will be different for, say, a football lineman versus a competitor who it needs to diet down to essential body fat levels. So there is, some wiggle room there and some caveats, but it doesn't provide really strict guidance. And then I think a nice addition to that research is actually a meta-regression that came out in early 2022 by Murphy and colleagues, which actually provided some type of big picture quantification of this. And that is energy deficiency impairs resistance training gains in lean mass, but not strength, and meta-analysis and meta-regression. And this is cool because it's actually saying, okay, well, that theoretically sounds good by Slater and colleagues, and it makes sense. But what are we talking about here? What happens when you're in an energy deficit? So we kind of have the theoretical, and then we have the quantification, which I think is an important thing to be able to say, hey, here's what I think happens, which we have a lot of voices in the evidence-based community doing that, but we've also seen how that's often gone wrong. Like our understanding of like P ratios has been kind of turned on its head when we only have the theory without actually, testing the model, like stress testing it. So I think Murphy's meta-regression is a really good kind of stress test of this idea. Like, okay, well, you at least need to be in maintenance because it can be bad the other way.
Mhm.
And what they found, and again, there's a huge amount of variance around this point estimate, was that once you got to the point when you're in a 500 calorie deficit, on average, when looking at this meta regression, you're seeing a cessation of muscle gain. Now, obviously, there's a ton of other caveats to that, and you can look at numerous studies where you have overweight individuals who are putting on substantial lean mass comparable to studies where they're actually in a surplus in a deficit. So there are influencing variables on this, but when you do a meta regression or meta analysis, all that gets collapsed into a point estimate with a confidence interval around that standardized mean difference, or in a meta regression, the actual relationship. So when we say that, hey, at the point you're in a 500 calorie deficit, you're not going to see gains, that is the average of the people who are losing substantial muscle and some people who are gaining substantial muscle because they have the characteristics or the environmental conditions that allow them to build muscle in the deficit, while these people, it's exacerbated even further. So ultimately, the meta regression is really useful by Murphy because it does tell us there's a sliding scale here. The larger the deficit, the more likely it is that you're not putting on muscle mass. And under a 500 calorie deficit, on average, people are actually able to put on muscle in a deficit. But because it is a regression and we're seeing this relationship, it implicitly tells us that the larger the deficit, the more challenging this is. And the logical assumption is therefore, okay, well, once I get out of a deficit, it continues to be linear. Like, the larger the surplus, the better the muscle gain. And that, I think, is what is less clear and why we did the recent research we did. But I'll leave it there since your question was specifically about a deficit. So from a mechanistic perspective, we do see, for all the reasons we brought up in Slater, that energy is really helpful for building muscle. Um,
Absolutely.
so, for example, when we look at muscle protein synthesis rates, when someone is in a large acute deficit, they're suppressed. The response to protein, the response to training, it's less. And when you take someone who's lean and in a deficit, you actually see higher muscle protein breakdown as well, which is probably at least part of the reason why there's that variance around that point estimate in the regression to where, yeah, 500 calorie deficit's roughly where you stop gaining muscle. But then you take a look at, say, Demling and DeSantis 2000, where they had overweight police officers putting on heaps of muscle, while dieting on, like just taking a protein supplement and lifting weights, and they're gaining an amount of muscle mass that we would think would be ideal in someone of a more normalized BMI category who is, training in at maintenance or surplus. So there is you have to somehow fuel the process of building muscle. And when you have less tissue that can be metabolized for energy readily to make up for that, and when you're not consuming food, and you also have a really high threshold of how far you've gone with your gains, so that you would need a year of non-impeded energy intake to put on a kilo of muscle. What are you going to expect in a 12-week study in a deficit, right?
Absolutely.
And so yeah, I would agree. It's very clear that a deficit in a kind of graded fashion is likely to impede muscle gain, with a lot of context around that. But certainly one can build muscle in a deficit and definitely at maintenance. And then the remaining frontier to kind of explore, which has been explored a little bit, and we're very honored to be one of the research groups who's done that, is looking at, well, what different magnitudes of surplus versus maintenance might have an impact on that, and to what degree.
Absolutely. No, Eric, that was a great analysis of what we have up to this date, because the Murphy meta regression, actually, if you look at the chart, I know you're very familiar with this. If you actually look at the graph of the different studies, there is within the meta regression where they're outside of a deficit. So there is around there, you see people at maintenance, so zero, they're right at energy balance, but you also see around a 100 to 200 calorie surplus. And you'll actually
Mm,
see the chart go up in terms of their lean mass accretion or their ability to gain lean mass. And then it starts going down. And then, as you alluded to, around a 500 calorie deficit on average is where lean mass gains were impaired, meaning that's where essentially just maintenance is essentially attained. And then from there, we start seeing like dips. And we're looking at like contest prep bodybuilder case studies, Rousseau and things like that, where they're losing precipitous amounts of lean mass, but also just
mhm,
the act. And we have some shorter term studies where we look at the consequences or the physiological ramifications of being in an energy deficit. So we have multiple studies that look at short term energy deficits. Pasiakos and colleagues is one study where they did, I believe, a 20% deficit for 10 days. I want to say they lost 1 kilogram, and it was like 19% of a suppression in muscle protein synthesis rates. We have another Areta study a few years later. They put them in a 33% calorie deficit. It was essentially they brought them from 45 kcals per kilogram of fat free mass down to 30. So right at that energy availability threshold, which a lot of people allude to from like the LOX or LAUX data. And they had a suppression of, I believe, 27%. So we see mechanistically in previous data that it will suppress muscle protein synthesis levels. We can rescue that though through the inclusion of resistance training as well as combining that with sufficient protein intake post workout. However, then we go to, you were alluding to, when someone's lean. So we have research dating back to the 1990s. You recently did, actually a couple months ago, a review on this, like a mass blast from the past, where it was an ELIA study, which showed that essentially, as compared to, this was in semi-starvation conditions, but lean individuals, I believe it's a 2 to 3 fold greater increase in protein oxidation as compared to obese individuals. But even if we take that to more recent data, Carbone and colleagues looked at this as well, and we see a substantial increase in muscle protein degradation or muscle protein breakdown rates. So really what we're trying to allude to is being into a deficit is a suboptimal place in terms of trying to maximize muscle growth. And then we also have to look at why would we need, or why would an energy surplus be conducive for muscle gain? And that's where the study that, or the review that you did with Slater was incredible, because a lot of times we speak about metabolic adaptations on the downside. So when you're in an energy deficit, we see a down regulation in energy expenditure and all these different hormonal axes, which are going to decrease the amount of calories you burn per day and essentially eat away at the deficit. But in the same fashion, when we increase our energy intake, we build metabolically active tissue, because that's what lean mass is. We actually see positive adaptations where you start to eat away at the surplus. So what was once a 200, 300 calorie surplus may not be. So if we look at even just the NEAT overfeeding research, we have Levine and colleagues, 1999 study, where they saw the average person in 1,000 calorie surplus for 8 weeks increase their energy expenditure by 328 calories. Now, that's on average. However, there was one individual, he almost swallowed that whole thing up. He had a 700 calorie increase in NEAT, whereas there was, some females actually, if you look into the entire like individual plots, one decreased their calorie expenditure by 98 calories. So that was the person that overfed on Thanksgiving and sat on their couch all day. But they did that for an 8 week period of time. And so, it's really interesting to look from a mechanism perspective, but really with the Slater and colleagues paper, I did quite an extensive review on it during the presentation that I did. And it was so interesting to look at all the different mechanisms, like the calorie cost of increased protein turnover. That, some research shows that that's 20% of our basal metabolic rate. The calorie cost of resistance training, which a lot of people overlook. But think about it like this. You're essentially, when we look at energy expenditure from resistance training, it's based on total workload. So if you are, in a building phase, you're in a surplus, you're sufficiently fueling yourself, and you're engaging in progressive resistance training, over time, your volume load is going up, which also means your total work output is going up, which means your calorie expenditure from exercise or from those training sessions are going up. We also see other increases in total daily energy expenditure due to that adaptive increase in, adaptive thermogenesis, essentially. So there's a lot of the energetic costs of building muscle. And that's really where then we get to look at some of the other data in terms of, now we know, all right, to optimize, in terms of muscle protein synthesis, in terms of being able to actually sufficiently fuel the energetic demands of increase or of building muscle, now we can look at some of the research in terms of, let's compare different surpluses. So what I'd really like to do is, before we get into your weight gain study, I'd love to hear how the previous research done on the topic of how different energy intakes impact both muscle gain and fat gain influence the hypothesis you had leading into the most recent study. Because seeing as your study was done on intermediate to advanced trainees, and I'm going to let you expand upon exactly the participant, the subject pool that you had. But the first two things I thought of, and this is funny, the first time I ever had you on the podcast, this was the first study that I asked you about. And this is going back to 2022. And I know you had this, pretty much in the works since 2018. So this has been a long time coming. But up until that point, if we really think about it, when you were going to make your hypothesis for the study, the only two studies I could think of that were out that even are in comparable subject populations are Garth et al. 2013, and then after you had already started the process of going into the study, we had Ribeiro 2019. So how did that work influence what you guys were thinking in terms of what is going to happen when we, essentially compare and contrast different size surpluses on their effects on both muscle gain and fat gain?
Yeah, and there's also another one that came out around the time we were finishing up that came out of Tinsley's lab
Mm-hmm. Smith and colleagues.
by, yeah, Smith and colleagues, and they used actually a pretty similar method to us using a Bayesian regression. And then there's also a study I want to bring up by Rosnick and colleagues that happened in 2002. Um, and they paint, I think now that we've completed our study, they paint a pretty cohesive narrative, but it wasn't the case when we were in process and Smith wasn't out yet. And we had, like you said, Ribeiro and the other research. The only real study looking at like well-trained individuals arguably was Garth, and there was some confounders there. So I think we can start with the typical criticism of like a lot of exercise science research is that it's done on recreationally trained or untrained individuals primarily. And even the trained populations that are studied, if we're in our little bodybuilding sector, like we are very snooty about what we consider a trained. Like, so how many Mr. Olympias were in this study? Oh no, that's not applicable. But I think to some degree, that's almost the content creator bias rather than thinking about our audience, where the vast majority of people who probably even consume the more advanced quote unquote content from someone like a Mike Israetel of RP, or like when we've polled our audience at 3D Muscle Journey, or I'm sure even your listeners, even though you have like a competitive bodybuilding tilt to some of your things, and both hosts, right? A lot of them are probably intermediates, and would blend in and mesh very well with the typical participant population in a quote unquote trained study. And it's more of like, you and I who are like, well, I want to know what I need to do. It's like, well, yeah, it's pretty
Yeah,
rare.
I'm gonna be honest. I think most people think that they're much more advanced than they are. And here's the issue with that. You don't want to be advanced. You don't want to be, really trying to stack every single,
Yeah.
card in your favor, like you and I are, Eric, like trying to just get that last ounce, like you always allude to, like 100 grams of tissue on your side delts. Like you don't want to be advanced. And the other thing with that, I think a lot of people think that they've hit their genetic limitation or their genetic ceiling. And really what they've hit is their lifestyle limitation. They just,
Yeah.
it's not conducive. They've gotten older. Like they I have a lot of clients that come to me and say, I want to look like I did in college. well, what did you do in college? How many hours were you able to train in college? What was,
Yeah.
your dietary intake like? What was your lifestyle? What was your stress like? What was your work schedule like? You didn't have any of these confounders. You didn't have 5 kids, a business, all these other responsibilities, stresses, and things of that sort. So I really do think that a lot of the studies we have, including Garth, which is on elite athletes, I understand that they're not advanced trainees in terms of resistance training, but they were actually, they had qualified for the Norwegian Olympic team. So they were quite good athletes. And even if we look at like the context, I mean, we had rowers, we had track and field athletes, but honestly, the vast majority, if you actually look at the population, it's actually ice hockey players. So these are people that are,
Yeah. They lift.
they're engaging. Yeah, absolutely. It's almost like when we have studies on rugby players like Appleby et al. 2012, like those guys are pretty jacked.
Yes.
So, I think it's really is applicable. A lot of the research we have, a lot of times people say, well, that doesn't apply to me. It's not, my population. And unless you're
Hmm.
really training advanced bodybuilders, it is your population. It's probably pretty applicable.
Yeah. And I would say actually the biggest critique that people don't really level at Garth that I think is worth considering is that they maintain their sport specific training. So anyway, let's talk about what do we got. So Rosnick, I think, is one of the most telling ones because it actually explains the rosy optimism and amazing experiences we have as newbies. It was done on untrained young men, so you got a bunch of like college dudes with time to lift, and they were basically given a weight gainer, like 2,000 calories on top of their habitual diet. And there was 3 different groups. The one group did not have the weight gainer and just kept eating their habitual diet. One group got all carbs, another one got like a carb protein weight gainer, right? And in the 2 groups that got the weight gainer, it didn't even make a difference that one was just pretty much taken straight up maltodextrin, and the other one actually got some whey protein mixed in there. They both gained on average, like I think it was around 3 kilograms of mass
Eight
over
weeks.
this over 8 weeks. Yes.
Crazy.
And 3 kilograms of lean mass, meaning that they gained pretty much probably not pure muscle and definitely not dry muscle, but throwing 2,000 calories on top of your diet doesn't mean it's 2,000 calorie surplus, or they would have gained even more weight, notably. But it because for all those reasons of energy expenditure ramping up. But they had like, basically the dreamer perfect bulk. Like the dream was true. They woke up and it's like it's real. I gained almost a pound a week of muscle eating 2,000 calories more than I'm supposed to. So Ronnie Coleman was right. Like the magazines were right. And this is in the era of the magazines. So I think it supported that. But we can't look past the fact that they were young, untrained individuals, right? So the more sobering data on the other end of the spectrum is Garth. And it was perhaps maybe a little too sobering, I think, in some cases. But it was done on elite athletes, like we talked about. We just discussed the population, and they were basically doing an upper lower split. And they either got nutritional counseling where they were put into a reasonable size surplus, individualized for them and their weight gain goals over a given period of time, or they were kind of left to their own devices to gain weight and not being magazine influenced young men. That actually meant a smaller surplus. They were eating on average 600 calories less than the RD counseled weight gain group. And they were doing a pretty good weight training program. Like I said, 4-day upper lower split, focus on the compound movements, progressive overload. What we would describe as like a pretty standard, like bodybuilding style training on top of their sport specific training. And Olympic qualified athletes, they never, even in the off season, stop training for their sport. So this is a concurrent training study, which I think we need to acknowledge, which is one of the pieces to it. And what they observed was that there was no significant difference in strength or muscle mass gains between the 2 groups. The means were a little bit higher in the group that ate more for primarily lean mass and a few strength metrics, but actually lower for things like the jump height and the sprint distance because they
Yeah,
just gained more
they got
weight.
better.
Exactly. And almost the entire difference in weight gain between the 2 groups was explained by fat mass gain on average when you look at it. So it paints a very negative picture of quote unquote bulking for trained lifters that, what, if you're in any kind of sizable surplus past a small one, it's just all going to become fat. And I don't think that's a bad assumption, but I don't think it's necessarily always true. And trained is like we said, that's not a blanket statement you can make about someone being trained. Like we talked about, there's late stage novices, there's highly advanced athletes, that's it's a huge spectrum. And I think that's where Smith was useful. That's the one that came out of Tinsley's lab. And they had something that I would describe as like a late stage novice as their average participant. So they had to have at least 6 months of prior resistance training experience, training 2 to 5 days per week. and they had to at least be able to bench body weight and leg press 2 times their body weight on a 1 rep max. Now that is I would consider that a relatively low bar. Now there's obviously going to be some people in the study who exceeded that, and there's going to be some people who just met it. That's if you anytime you've done research, you realize that the standard to get into the study is not the average, and unless they actually report that, you kind of have to just kind of take that with a grain of salt. Now, this is also a regression. And an important thing about a regression that I really like is instead of just comparing groups like Garth did, you get a continuous analysis, which is much stronger statistically, and it gives us a better understanding of what's going on. And what they found was that on average, and again, same caveats that applied to the meta regression, which is just doing this with a bunch of studies instead of just a bunch of people, is that there's tremendous variation around this. So this is just the average, but they found that gaining about 0.55% of one's body mass per week, which is quick, if you think about it, that's gaining a pound a week if you're in the 200 pounds kind of male range, right? And then scaling down from that as you're lighter. So not quite as fast as Rosnick. This is a 6-week study, but still pretty quick. At that point, that's what corresponded with the body composition score that was primarily fat-free mass. However, the way you can describe the strength of a relationship, there's something called an R score or an R squared score. An R squared score says, okay, when you're doing a regression, and I'll try to be very simplified in this statistics explanation, you're looking at the relationship between two variables. In this case, it's how much weight was gained, and then how much of it and how lean was it, right? So the rate of weight gain, and then how much of that was primarily lean mass, or in this case, the various metrics of hypertrophy. And when they looked at the relationship between weight gain and changes in hypertrophy from muscle thickness and across various metrics, they had R squared scores from 0.18 to 0.4. And what that means is that the amount of variation around that explains 18 to 40% of the outcome. So that's not much, right? I mean, it's substantial, but knowing that the majority from anywhere from 82 to 60 to 82% of what's going to predict how lean your gains are is actually unrelated to your nutritional intake, I think is very telling. So yes, on average, in this relationship, we see 100% lean mass gains when you're getting 0.55% of your body weight per week, but that only is describing a minority of that relationship in the model at all. Meaning that how you're training, your sleep, all these other factors, genetic factors, environmental factors, are going to be explaining the lion's share of what's going on. So I think you can look at this and go, right, so I need to be in a, 300, 400, 500 calorie surplus, depending on my body mass, and that'll be perfect. And it's like, well, for the average point, but probably not. So this paints a rosier picture, not quite as just like, eat 2,000 calories a day on top of your diet like Rosnick, and you're going to gain all muscle and, everything that Flex Magazine promised is true. But it's basically saying that, hey, the same approach you take to dieting, the same relative deficit, you should make that your relative surplus. And that is basically what Garth did, and it didn't go well. So
Mhm.
we're starting to see this kind of narrative as we have different participant pools of what's going on. So
I think
that's where
that's really
we
big to hit on.
stepped in. Yeah, exactly. That's where we stepped in and tried to kind of fill that gap a bit with our recent research.
Absolutely. So just for the audience to know, I'll do a little recap. Essentially, what we're looking at is different client populations, essentially, and training populations, and the difference or the discrepancy in the relationship between their calorie intake and their ability to gain lean mass. So if we look at Rosnick 2002, a 2,000 calorie surplus in brand new untrained individuals, they got their newbie gains. If we look at the carbohydrate or the protein and carbohydrate group, actually their carbohydrate group actually gained more lean mass. So I believe it was 3.3 kilograms. And so they gained about 7 pounds of lean mass. And it was essentially, I mean, one of the groups, actually the protein and carb group, I believe they actually recomped. They lost a little bit of body fat, very minuscule. So it was a minuscule recomp, but it was 2.9 kilograms of fat-free mass that they gained in that study. So entirely, this was like the P ratio of the
Went
gods,
well.
essentially. Smith, we go to little bit more late stage than the opposites, essentially. And they're able to gain at a pretty substantial rate, but 0.55% per week, which is very quick. So if we're looking at 0.55% per week, that's about 2.2% per month, which is a really quick rate of gain as compared to what we would use with intermediate or advanced trainings. Then we look at Garth. Garth et al., what they found was that it was pretty there was an insignificant difference between lean mass gains. And actually, what they found was that um, the group that was in the large surplus, so the nutritional counseling group, I believe they gained 1.1 kilograms of fat mass in addition to the lean mass that they gained. But if you look at the small surplus or the ad libitum group, that's what they had labeled them at, they gained 0.2 kilograms. So essentially, the in the Garth study, the large surplus group gained 5.5 times the amount of fat. So they're intermediate trainees. We see this when we go into this large surplus, you're getting even more fat mass as compared to lean mass gains. Then we go to Ribeiro, which is actually on competitive bodybuilders. And if we look at the lean mass to fat mass ratios, this always like drives me wild because Greg Knuckles was the one that actually did these back calculations. And if I remember correctly, it was the group that was in the large surplus. There was a large surplus and a moderate surplus group. They were advanced trainees. They had at least 1 year of competitive bodybuilding under their belt. And what they saw was that the group that was in the large surplus, I believe they gained 2.4 kilograms of fat free mass and they gained 1.8 kilograms of fat mass as compared to the other group, which gained 1.2 kilograms of fat free mass and zero point 0.3 kilograms of fat free mass. So if we look at the discrepancy between them, yes, the large surplus group gained double the amount of fat free mass. However, they also gained 6 times the amount of fat mass. So if we look at the distribution or the lean mass to fat mass ratio, the large surplus group was gaining 4 parts lean mass to 3 parts fat mass, as compared to the moderate surplus group that was gaining 4 parts lean mass to 1 part fat mass. So if we were to put them on a chart essentially, and they were gaining at the same rate of gain, we would see that the large surplus group was gaining fat for the same amount of fat free mass at 3 times the rate. If we go back to the Garth study, we actually look at the rate of gains. If you break it down and you go through the whole study, the large surplus group that gained 5.5 times as much fat mass was gaining at 0.4% per week, as compared to the ad libitum group, which gained significantly less fat mass, and they gained at 0.2% per week. So now we see it's almost like, I always say this to clients, the size of your surplus is like a sliding scale, but so is the rate of gain. So the more advanced you get, the more we need to slide down, because essentially the slower your rate of gain is, the closer you are to your genetic ceiling. So now we have to essentially utilize it's more beneficial to utilize a smaller surplus the more advanced you get in terms of being able to accrete lean mass, as compared to gaining an excessive amount of fat mass. So this is where your study comes into play, because this is essentially, you guys did a very nice comparison. So I do want to get into your recently published study, which is on the effect of small and large energy surpluses on muscle and skin fold thickness and strength in resistance trained individuals. And I know a lot of individuals in our space have already covered this study on YouTube, on Instagram, and on podcasts, but they were reporting what was found in the preprint. However, I believe there were some slight adjustments that you guys made to the paper as a result of the peer review process. So I wanted to have you on as the head author of the study to hear the study findings and a more correct interpretation of the study findings, as I believe many took this study to mean that bulking doesn't work and that an energy surplus is not beneficial for muscle growth. And I think we can really extrapolate this out and really go into it. But, can we go through, the design, the study design essentially, in terms of who the participants were, that were included in the study, the training program design, and then also the different nutritional interventions that you guys utilized?
Mm-hmm. I think one thing I do want to bring up, and the reason why I don't talk about the Ribeiro study very much, is because their methods, I think, are fundamentally flawed. Sorry, guys, to the point where you really don't actually want to take anything away from it.
And that
So,
was how that was based on how they calculated the the equation that they utilized. But didn't Greg clean that up?
uh, I mean, I don't know that you can really, like, because like if you think of like the input data of what they used, um, the variables in the equation were height, weight, sex, and race. So that
So the
means
more
that
weight you gain, the more lean mass you gain.
yeah, exactly. There's no way around that. So I mean, maybe, and if he got access to the individual data, maybe he did. But when I reviewed it back in mass, um, we didn't oh, we'll often reanalyze stuff if we have access to the data, but we didn't at that point when Greg was still a part of it. But I want to say the only data they collected, because they did body composition assessments, they did height and weight via stadiometer, and they did skin fold assessments. Um, but the issue, so like you have skin fold thicknesses taken, and then you've got height and weight. But I don't know that is like, there are other equations you can use. I'm not sure there are good ones that I would put a lot of faith in for estimating, how much skeletal muscle mass is actually there. Um, certainly not ones that would apply to competitive bodybuilders. So it's a tough one. Um, I think you would need more data. Like no matter how you torture that data, I have a tough time seeing how you could um, really get a good estimate of lean mass changes from that. You can absolutely get an estimate of just like who gained more fat mass, right? And then just I mean that's probably if Greg did do something with it, would have just been like,
I think so. I'm
which is
almost certain I pulled those numbers. I have them off the top
yeah,
of my head because I did a presentation on them. But the
yeah,
numbers in terms of fat mass and then fat free mass, I got from either I'm almost certain I got it from the mass article, like the archive, or from
yep.
strongerbyscience.com.
Yeah, so if you're looking at the mass one, I do report like what is the actual change in in fat-free mass or skeletal muscle mass. But the issue is that those are coming from an equation where it is purely based upon um, the changes in those variables, and that's the problem, right?
Okay. I understand. The numbers I quoted
Yeah,
were correct because I'm looking at it right now. It does say the high energy
yep.
group increased fat free mass by 3%, which was 2.4 kilograms, and fat mass by
Oh
12.4%,
no,
which was
Greg.
1.8
Yeah,
kilograms.
no, I am remembering now. I'm actually misremembered. Greg
I have
did.
it up here.
Yeah, okay. So you're probably looking at the same thing. Um, Greg did kind of go, let's just look at what happened in fat mass and assume everything else is lean mass. And I think that's fair. And it's a bit salvageable, but there's a lot of assumptions that go into that.
Mhm.
As someone who's, done a fair bit of anthropometry, um, it's tough, So yeah, but I think that's fair. Like saying that the slow gain group was gaining lean to fat mass at a 4-to-1 ratio and the fast group was gaining lean to fat mass at a 4-to-3 ratio. I think that's probably accurate, right? I
Especially
think
if
I
we
think
look at I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with the study. I recently
yeah,
went through it, but the energy surplus that they were in over their metabolic requirements was astronomical. The
it's
high energy
huge.
surplus group was in at eating 1,100 grams of carbohydrates per day, and the
Yeah,
moderate group, moderate, quote unquote, was 700 grams of carbs per day. And so
yeah,
I believe the high energy group was over 6,000 calories, and the moderate energy group. Now, mind you, these are 90-kilogram bodybuilders. These are large individuals, 200 pounds. They were training
yeah.
6 days per week on a high volume training program, training every body part twice per week. So very much in line with the evidence-based recommendations. But even the
Mhm.
moderate group was eating 4,500 calories. I mean, that's immense.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's all very well said. I think the methods used are just something where I think at a very high level, I'm very comfortable with that statement about Ribeiro that like, hey, look, we're looking at a 4-to-1 versus 4-to-3 ratio. They're gaining, a fair bit more fat mass, but it is, I think when you're just looking at a couple of skin fold measurements in height and weight, um, yeah, it's tough, unfortunately. But nonetheless, it does tell a clear story, right? Like large surpluses are largely serving to put on fat mass and not seeming to help. So where we stepped in, which I think is really helpful, is we went, all right, well, let's look at a small surplus, a moderate surplus, and then maintenance. And the preprint wasn't tremendously different from the final one, Brandon. It's one of the funny things that happened though is that we actually transposed which group was which. And the reason that happened is because these findings were very similar. So we made one data entry error, and it looked like the moderate and the heavy group were, I
Essentially,
think it
were
was the gain.
reversed.
Yeah, they were reversed, but the gains were the same. Like they actually made very similar mean changes in lean mass. So, we looked at ultrasound derived muscle thickness
Mhm.
at the bicep, tricep, and quadricep, and we also looked at skin fold thickness is not converted into body fat percentage, so very precise measurement of 8 sites. So that's the ISAC standard. So 8 site skin fold measurements, and also 1 RM bench press and 1 RM squat. And we did this in pretty well trained individuals. So they had to have at least a year, men and women, very few women, unfortunately. And we had a big statistical issue because of COVID. Like you mentioned, I started applying to get this, funded and ethics approved in 2018. We started collecting in 2019, and then bam, all of 2020 and 2021 made us restart the study multiple times, and we finished with 17 participants when we intended to have like 30. Um, so the initial comparisons we were planning on doing was a group versus group versus group, and partially influenced by seeing the regression from Tinsley's lab, and then also just me becoming, a better methodologist, and then also as a way to still provide meaningful data while being underpowered, is I was like, hold on, why do we have to do a group versus group comparison? Also, considering that when we actually got the data back and we saw that the amount of weight gain was the same in the moderate and the large surplus group, it became very apparent that you can, even with a dietitian consulting weekly, basically doing online coaching, who is an online coach as well, and us doing video calls and meeting with these people and training them 3 days per week in the lab, um, a prescribed surplus and a prescribed weight of weight gain and an actual surplus and an actual weight of weight gain in real life living humans, um, there's going to be a discrepancy. And this is not necessarily because of adherence. It is just
Let's
because
pull
of
that
all
apart a
those
little bit.
factors. Yeah, like you talked about, some people go into a 98 calorie lower energy expenditure from being overfed. Some people a 600 calorie or 700 calorie higher, right? So I think ultimately you have to do what's feasible for the study. So for our study, we had these well-trained individuals, and it did actually include some competitive powerlifters, some competitive bodybuilders, and it also did include some people who were non-competitors who just liked lifting and who barely met our strength standard. So
So Eric,
they're,
on the whole,
yes.
what would you consider your average participant in the study? Would you say, a novice stage intermediate or a late stage intermediate? Like, what would you categorize the average? You're in the lab with them, so you got to see them train, you got to see their muscular development. You were able to obviously consult with them. What would you categorize them based because obviously we have to look at a group average, when you
Yes.
report in the study, and really the I guess the inclusion criteria for them to be a participant. Well, what would you consider them?
True intermediates is what I would
Perfect.
describe them as. Yeah. Consisting of a mixture of early stage intermediates to advanced. So these are people who have been lifting for multiple years, and they do have head scratching moments and plateaus, and they want to see if they can make gains, and they're consuming, you know they're serious lifters. I think it's a good way to look at it. And I think that's cool. So we got a good population. The downside of that is that the training program that we put them on, which is logistically feasible for both parties, was in some cases probably not enough of a stimulus. So that is I'd say the biggest limitation of the work we did. It's not that we didn't train them hard, but by necessity, when you have people coming in 3 days per week, you're essentially looking at a low to moderate volume compared to what a true intermediate trainer would do on average. Certainly not for everyone. And then what you need to do is kind of push them pretty hard. So the way we did that is that every day they came in, they squat and they benched. So it started with squat, bench, and then they did a shoulder, a back, and a bicep exercise on top of that. So it isn't even necessarily a super well constructed program from an exercise selection standpoint, but we have to think about the time of the investigators and the time of the people coming into the lab.
And
And then we
that's
think
huge.
about,
That's something that many people overlook,
yes,
and they're like, "Well, why didn't they train 6 days per week like a bodybuilder?" Well, first and foremost, it's during the COVID lockdowns. Second of all, like, what is the realistic feasibility of getting people in the lab with, especially within COVID? I mean, I'm sure you could,
yeah,
expand upon this, but think about just the circumstances. We had a distancing, enactment, and really, when it comes down to it, it's you need to supervise these individuals. So it's so much time on the subjects, it's so much time on the research participants and your staff as well as yourself, that a lot of people, I hear a lot of criticisms about research, and often I'm trying to get across to whether it be my clientele or the people that I work with or even the other coaches that I know, that research is just a guide. It points us in a direction. It's not telling us how to train, on Friday, which is tomorrow, or anything of the sort. But we can take findings away from this, and the limitations of this is like, listen, 3 days per week is what was realistic, what was feasible, what we were able to get people to come in and comply to. And then also we have to think about the fact that we want people to actually finish out the study, and that we don't
mhm,
have a bunch of fallouts as a result of having such, strict inclusion criteria. Because I mean, I know you can expand upon this, but if they were to miss multiple sessions, say it was 6 days per week, the ability for people to get through this, you guys wanted to have 30, it ended at 17, you probably would have had a group less than 10 if it was that much of, a constraint essentially.
yeah. So there are ways to get around this, and I think it's going to get better and better, which is cool. Sports science is evolving, and this is something we realized, to find the silver lining. Um, one of the things we were able to do during COVID, because there were we had like multiple different lockdowns, and sometimes it was absolutely no, the labs are closed, nothing you can do. And there was a period where they were like, well, if you can maintain social distancing in the lab, and if you can protect the participant and you can protect the researchers, then you can do it. So we had this period, shout out to my PhD student, Colby Sousa, where we had Cyber Colby. And what we had to have was staff on site, and then we had to have really significant social distancing, to the point where essentially they couldn't be in the lab with the participant. So we have our labs are set up kind of like a T shape. So we have like this, that's actually not a good description. So we have a hallway on the left and right. We have our biomechanics lab, and then we have our sports physiology lab. And then at the end of it, we have a longer lab, a bigger lab for the S&C, which is where our participants are training, right? So I was hanging out in the physiology lab with the door open so I could see what's going on, right? But not able to actually be in the room with them because of social distancing, masked up, everything. Participants masked up, which is probably making things harder, like squats. Um, and they have to load their own plates, which is a limitation when you really want to have the type of control that you would like to have. Like we load the plates for the participants typically, and then wheeling around a wheelie chair is Colby on Skype.
Oh, I love
So
this. This is
yeah, so
incredible.
so Colby is sitting there watching, and he's like verbally encouraging them, like he's supposed to. He's having them look at the RPE printout after each set. He's encouraging them to go to failure, making sure they're hitting depth, touching their chest on the bench. So he's doing all the things he would do there in person, but he's not spotting them. Now, fortunately, they're benching and squatting in a cage, so we were able to get approval for that without spotters. But these are trained individuals, and on the squat and the bench press, they weren't going to failure. They're going to failure on everything else. So they started each session. They had like a periodized daily undulating approach to the squat and bench, where they're going from 10 reps down to like 4 over the course of this 8-week period. It is a good program for strength on bench and squat. And I think literally everybody got stronger, which is a good sign. Unfortunately, though, and I'll spoil the plot as to getting to the outcomes, did not seem affected 1RM by the presence of a surplus or maintenance or the size of the surplus. So there was no relationship between weight gained and the amount of bench press or squat strength gained. When we looked at this regression that we did on all 17 completers. Um, so there, but everybody got stronger. So that's a good sign. And so basically it says, hey, if you have a good program, that's by far the most important thing for short-term strength gains. Slightly different story for body composition, which I'll get into. But then kind of going back to the realities, getting people the behind the curtain view. Cyber Colby here. He's on a video call, physically there with them, doing all the things except he can't spot them. And I'm in the other room. In case something disastrous does happen, I can run in and obviously deal with that from like a safety perspective. But we had to do that, and we had a few participants who would have otherwise dropped out of the study. We had a few other participants who had access to a squat and a bench press in their own garage or home, and we were able to do the strength test on one day, and then the body composition assessment on another day, and we kind of like shoehorned that into we had to have a conversation like, do we think this is fair? Like, yeah, they got 48 to 72 hours before we take it. So if that's 48 hours and then that's 72 hours, because it just landed right around when the lockdown was ending. So we had one participant in that scenario. We had another participant who we only got strength data, but not their post test. So it was very challenging to get even the level of completion we did. In the future, having that lesson of seeing what Cyber Colby could do, is we would probably do something similar to what Max Coleman did for his deload study, have them come into the lab 3 days per week, do supervised training, and then video train with them at their, not everyone can do this in the gym, or at least send us videos of their training, which everyone can probably do these days, and have them training, 4 to 6 days per week, which is, paralleling what actual bodybuilders and most very serious trainees do. And now all of a sudden the feasibility of looking at higher trained individuals is becomes realistic. So that's something I think we'll do in the future, and I think we'll see more labs doing is those kind of mixed procedures, because there is a benefit to supervision, and there's actually been quantified, and I'm part of some papers on
Just
that.
recently.
Yep. And there's a difference between momentary muscular failure and volitional failure, which we've talked about, and that is primarily occurring because of supervision, the ability to actually get there. So the one thing I can say is they were training very hard the 3 days they came in. and very effectively based upon the strength gains. Like this is a really solid 3 day per week, standardized, cookie cutter program. It's about as good as it could be within those constraints for strength. And then for hypertrophy, they're doing 3 sets on like a back, a shoulder, and a bicep exercise to failure, being pushed to an RPE 10 by our lab group. So yeah, it was low volume, but it was also high intensity, and that definitely is an important factor to consider. So anyway, we had these 17 individuals for 8 weeks come in. They had to have weight stability, defined as not having a change greater than 1% in body weight for 2 weeks. And that sometimes took a month to occur. And during that period, our registered dietitian taught them how to track, gave them the guidelines. Everyone was on a standardized diet. And then they got randomized into either being in a 5% surplus, a 15% surplus, or the intention to be weight stable at maintenance. And then that was adjusted regularly with contact with the dietitian who we were blinded to. So those of us at AUT, not doing the nutrition but training them, and then we had Steve Taylor, the RD, who was working with them remotely on their nutrition, basically online coaching. And they were instructed not to tell us which diet they were on. Steve had the blinding code, and then we were just training everybody the same to try to reduce the potential influence of bias there. And also, when we're doing our ultrasound, not knowing which group they're in. And then we did muscle thickness and body composition via anthropometry, 1RM testing pre and post. Then you can see the group comparisons because that was our hypothesis and our original way of doing it, but those are underpowered analyses. We're looking at comparisons of 5 to 6 people. If you think about splitting a sample size of 17 into 3 groups, those are small groups, right? And it is the mistake that some people made is because I think we're so used to it in the fitness industry when we're kind of even looking at studies is which group did better. And I would just really encourage people when reading the paper to kind of ignore, in my opinion, the group-based differences because they are underpowered, and you get one person who's a high responder to bench press in one group or another, and it can make it look like something it's not. So, for example, we did see better bench press gains in the higher surplus group. It was misreported as the moderate surplus group in the preprint, and that also matches our anecdotal experiences, right? Yeah, weight gain really does help bench press, but we don't see a relationship between weight gain and bench press and the regression. So
Mhm.
I think that's a false positive, despite that being intuitive, despite people liking that finding if you have a bulking bias. Hell, that's my experience. If I put on a kilo of mass, I'm probably going to be able to bench, 2.5 kilos more. But that's not what we found. So the regression, again, just to describe what that was, is we just plotted the amount of weight gained, meaning if you're in the maintenance group and you gained a little bit of weight, or if you were in the small surplus group and you actually maintained, you might be in different positions. So this is a stronger analysis than the group versus group comparisons because just because you're assigned to a group for the reasons we talked about before doesn't mean that the outcome was exactly what was desired due to unexpected metabolic adaptation or people learning the ropes of tracking, adherence, all those things, and correcting over time. Getting better through the 8 week study at being able to meet that criteria and the natural lag of having a check-in and correcting the fact that you hadn't gained enough weight over the last 2 weeks for us to get the average and go, oh no, you've fallen below it. Let's increase calories, right? So all those factors are at play. Um, so by regressing, taking all 17 individuals and just plotting, okay, sum of 8 skin fold change, 1RM squat, 1RM bench press, and then muscle thickness changes at the tricep, bicep, and quadricep. How did each one of those variables relate to the amount of weight gained? And there were only 2 variables which had a significant relationship is not the right wording. We use Bayesian analysis. There were only 2 of those variables which had weak to strong evidence of being related to weight gain. And far and away, the strongest one was the sum of 8 skin folds. And in fact, weight gain explained about half of the variance of the sum and skin fold. So we talked earlier about Smith, how
Mhm.
only 18 to 40% of the variance in muscle gain was explained by weight gain. Here we have something more than that. What is it? Fat gain. So your surplus size is going to dictate the lion's, or at least not the lion's share, about half of whether or not you're going to gain a lot of fat. And that was what was considered strong evidence.
Mhm.
And the way that we do this with Bayesian analysis, real briefly, is you have basically an odds ratio for the hypothesis versus the null. And it was like a 10 to 1. So it is 10 times more likely that you'll gain more body fat than someone else by gaining more weight than them. I think it was like 10.4 or something like that, or I have
It
to
was
actually look.
significant. 14.3.
14.3. Yeah, that's right. 'Cause it's exactly 10 times because it was only
Yep.
1.4 for our other finding. Our other finding was biceps thickness. And here's the glimmer of hope that we have. And it actually kind of makes sense when you look at the method. So this is only explaining 25% of the variance. So this actually lines up really similarly to Smith. It's kind of right smack in the middle of their findings of how much weight gain explained. So only a quarter of the variance in bicep muscle thickness seemed related to the size of the surplus. So that means three-quarters of the prediction of how much muscle are you going to gain in your biceps while gaining weight is going to be related to other factors, sleep, training, whatever, genetic heritability, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. While it's half of it and very strong evidence, but the strength of that evidence, even though it was explaining 25% of the variance, was 1/10 that of the fat mass gains. It was only a 1.4 odds ratio, meaning if we took two random people out of the study and we went, okay, which one gained more weight? They'd only have a 1.4 times more likelihood, the person who gained more weight, of having gained more bicep thickness than the other person. Is an intuitive way of understanding that finding. But if we'd taken those same people and go, okay, but what's the likelihood of the person who gained more weight gaining more fat mass? It's 14 to 1, right?
That's a
So
shock. That's a shocking outcome, to be honest with
exactly. So that means, in a group of 17 people. So that means that almost every single person who gained more weight gained more fat than people who gain less weight. So it's a very linear relationship. And the strength of that is you can calculate it, 50%, that's an R squared score. So that if you were just to do the square root of that, that would tell you the pure R score, which sometimes we see as the correlation reported in things. So that's like, a R score in the zero point 0.7 range.
you.
Um, so yeah, it's a pretty strong relationship that larger surpluses put on more skin fold thicknesses in this group, and a glimmer of hope for biceps. And then the question became for us, well, okay, why didn't we see this in the quadriceps and why didn't we see it in the triceps? And that's when we look at our training program. The direct work for the triceps, or the only work, I should say, for the triceps and the quads came from the bench and the squat. So indirect, yeah, higher volume, higher frequencies, but really only a total of 9 working sets in each case, done between a like 1 to 4 RIR with relatively heavy loads. So that may not matter too much based upon a recent meta regression by Robinson, but it's a strength program, right? So we're looking at 9 sets for the triceps, 9 sets for the quadriceps, submaximal but decent proximity to failure. And then when we look at the amount of work done on the biceps, we see a mixture of direct and indirect work from the rows and pull downs, but also bicep curls. 9 sets direct work, 9 sets indirect work, 18 sets. That falls smack dab in the middle of the meta-analyses we have where we think the average person will probably have an appropriate volume to get the fastest rates of muscle gain. Of course, tons of individual variation, but we're looking at a group here, not an individual. So I think it's a reasonable thing to assume that that's good. And we also know that half of that, like all that volume was to failure because we pushed them to failure. So the fact that there was a relationship in the biceps and not the quadriceps and triceps is a really important finding here that tells us, there may be a chance at a bulk being more successful at later stages of development if you are also ensuring that your training is progressive in nature and stimulative. But if it's not, then it's pretty much just going to go to fat mass. Um, and I wish I could just tell everyone, oh, yeah, you go ahead and do a bulk, but you just need to do 18 sets and train to failure. But that's not the way this works. The amount of individual variation in how you respond to proximity to failure, how many sets you need to do, exercise selection, split. You take somebody like me, you compare them to somebody who doesn't respond as well to volume, very different programs that would be optimal. And we would need to be on very unique approaches as advanced athletes to be successful in our bulk. But the surplus would probably be similar, but the training variables would not. And you have to get them both to line up for a bulk to be successful. So, and even then, I I think it needs to be more conservative because again, it's a small proportion and weak evidence suggesting that biceps benefited from additional weight gain. So the overall take home is that you have to scale. I would surmise that scaling your surplus based upon how much more potential growth do you have, aka your training age or your proximity to your genetic potential theoretically. Um, it needs to occur, or you're going to put on excess fat mass. You might be okay with putting on excess fat mass if you want a mini cut, every couple months. But if you are looking for a better ratio of lean mass to fat mass gains, like we saw from that kind of back of the hand calculation in Ribeiro, then the size of the surplus should be smaller. And ultimately, that's kind of just the reality is that you can't force feed gains any more than your body will allow you to. Now, if you're like the folks in Rozenek, if you're a 21-year-old who's super motivated and getting to train in a lab environment for the first time you're ever lifting, yeah, that means you can put on pretty much a pound a week of pure muscle while drinking, sugar water for 2,000 calories a your diet. And yeah, it's gain, train, city, happy dreamer bulk days. But if you're coming in and you've been training for a couple years and you did a powerlifting meet and you're trying to put on more muscle and you're reading on like mass and you're listening to podcasts, scratching your head, how do I make gains? The answer is not let me just take a 2,000 calorie weight gainer unless you're really comfortable with your weight going up a lot without that actually impacting your muscle mass and primarily being fat mass. However, if you were to be in something like a 100, 200, maybe 300 calorie surplus, and you're also really attentively thinking, how do I optimize my training? And then supporting my training with my nutrition, that's kind of the paradigm of thinking you need to be in. You can have kind of the force feed the gains mentality as a rank novice when pretty much just looking at weights is going to make you grow and you get those newbie gains. But when you really have to kind of, put on the spectacles and start getting out the drawing board and the chalk to figure out what do I need to do to make gains and going back to the drawing board over and over when it doesn't necessarily pan out, you can't force feed it. It is essentially something that I've said for years is that your nutrition is permissive to your training. So if you're training, and again, and you're in like a deficit, even if your training's perfect, it's probably not going to go well, as we discussed. At a certain point, that deficit's just too large to support that progress. But the surplus that you can maximally benefit from when you're already close to your genetic ceiling is quite small. So you're kind of operating in an unfortunately narrow window when you're an advanced athlete. You can do the whole gaintaining thing, or you can do, you know, what you might call a bulk, but is not quite gaintaining, but really you're gaining like 1% of your body weight per month. You can do that, but you probably will eventually need to cut even then, even when your training is going perfectly. And when we talk about like, say, competitive advanced level natural bodybuilders who've had a great off season, I mean, a great off season, sometimes we're looking at their stage weight going up with taking, a year between competitions. Like, honestly, like, so I just competed in 2023. I got on stage about 175. Looking at my morning weigh-ins, maybe carved up higher than that. I think like the best case possible scenario, and I don't mean to constrain myself, but maybe if everything goes fantastically, I get on stage at 180, and that would be, I think that would be shocking to people if I put 5 pounds of muscle on at this stage in my career. And when you then back calculate that, like let's say that is true, and I've got uh, 17 months of gaining between my two seasons, right? Competing in November, and then starting my next November and finishing my season mid-November 2023 and starting my next diet in what would that be like April of 2025, that's almost a year and a half, right?
Mhm.
5 pounds in a year and a half. Like what is that on a monthly basis? Not much, right? It's like a quarter pound. So how do you quantify that? And what type of surplus size is that on average? It's less than 100 calories. So is that the best way to do it? Is just try to get into this little itty bitty surplus and like, just throw a sugar cube down before I go to bed while I'm eating at maintenance? Probably not. What probably makes more sense is you go through like a 6 month period of gaining, a pound a month, and then you do a cut to cut half of that off, and you rinse and repeat a few times. But the ratio is even in the best case scenario is probably not going to be great. So that's what we found, and I will say that there are limitations, even with the continuous analysis looking at all 17 individuals together who completed this study. That's a small sample size. The group versus comparisons, like I said, too small to really make any meaningful conclusions. But we did have a sufficient sample to make some, I think, good conclusions based on the regression. But it's still a small sample size, and it's still not the ideal or ecologically valid training program for the level of experience that the average participant had, where we did have some pretty well-trained individuals. You'd probably want to see a 4 day per week training program, more akin to what Garth did. But
Mhm.
then they have that concurrent training. They were, a mixture of different types of athletes. So there's more work to be done, but I think if we take Ribeiro, we take Smith, we take Rosnick, we take now Helms, and we take Garth, there is a relatively clear storyline here that you need to taper your expectations and therefore your surplus for how lean of gains you can make, at least in the short term. Again, the longest study out of all these is arguably Garth for some participants. It was as long as
That's
like
10
12,
weeks.
16 weeks. Yeah. Well, it was variable, right?
Yeah, it was a 10-week average what they looked at.
Yeah, exactly. So we've got a couple months and a half, like 2 to 3 months tops if you look at individual participants in Garth. That's not even as long as your typical like kind of evidence informed advanced or intermediate will go on a bulking phase. If
Absolutely.
they're taking a slower approach, they might do a 4 month bulk, 1 month cut, or something like that. So yeah, I would love it to run a 4 month bulking study where we're putting them into these same surpluses, but they have 4 days per week. And maybe that would be feasible if it hadn't had COVID. We thought of these things earlier, and we had the video consulting with them. But I think it would be a challenge to have a sufficient sample completing that. But it certainly could be done, maybe multi-site data collection, if we can do that, which is another thing that's coming out in the future. I'm very hopeful for studies coming out in the future, like a lot of debate and critique around length and partials right now. But, for example, Milo is leading a study where 3 or 4 different universities, one of which we're part of, like we contributed 7 participants to this study. And that's not much, but if you have 4 or 5 different universities doing that, now
Absolutely. It
we're
adds
talking
up.
about exactly. So, and we also were using video. So these individuals were doing their own habitual training with 3 days of upper body training on top of it, video checked, feedback to them, guidance. So, with the approaches we're going to take in the future, we can really start to get more ecological validity without sacrificing sample size or confidence in the precision. So anyway, that's just kind of a rambling, semi-coherent perspective on what it's like to do this research and why it's challenging. But when you have multiple studies where you can kind of take the strengths of each to come overcome the weaknesses of others, I think we do have a relatively clear narrative now on what do we know about bulking, and it is similar to what was said before, and probably that we need to temper our expectations as you get more well trained, and that training is more important than the surplus size.
100%. I think my biggest takeaway from all this research, and I've dug into this in detail because it is something that I practically apply in the real world with clients, but also
Mm.
something I get so many questions about because I really try to get across to my clientele or to people that I interact with that really on both ends of the spectrum, slow and steady wins the race. So let's think about it in the context of comparing, contrasting, building or bulking versus cutting. In a a fat loss phase, yes, the rate of loss, even if we look at evidence-based recommendations, we go back to Robert et al., which is nutritional recommendations for contest prep bodybuilders, which is a great paper that you are an author on. Your recommendations to mitigate to be able to effectively lose body fat while also maintaining lean mass was 0.5 to 1% rate of loss per week, which is fairly conservative, still a slow and steady rate of loss across a longer contest prep phase. And generally, you guys recommended about 16 weeks or longer. And so within that, that is the process of fat loss is far quicker and can be expedited much more substantially than can be muscle growth. But even within that, if we look at, there's a lot of people that want to rush the process on both ends of the spectrum. So when it comes to inducing a deficit, a lot of people will take an aggressive approach. What we see in most of the research that looks at aggressive approaches to weight loss and to fat loss, that yes, with larger deficits do come greater losses in body weight. However, with that come a greater predisposition and likelihood for lean mass losses. So now you're losing more scale weight, but it's less quality weight loss because you are losing a disproportionate amount of lean mass to fat mass, essentially. Whereas if we took a slow and steadier approach, just like you guys recommended, 0.5 to 1% rate of loss per week, you'd retain more of that lean mass and lose more sequentially. You would, as a result, lose more fat mass per pound of body weight loss. However, we
Yep.
look at the other side, when you rush the process in terms of muscle gain, you try to gain at an accelerated rate of muscle growth or rate of gain per week in terms of body weight increases per week, you end up just gaining more fat along the process. So now you're accruing the same amount of lean mass because physiologically we can only speed up the process so much. And really, when it comes down to it, the biggest impetus or the biggest, most robust stimulus we have for gaining muscle is the resistance training. And nutrition, as you said, is just permissive. It's supportive of that process. And really, what we're looking to do is, as we alluded to earlier in the podcast, get out of an energy deficit so that you are not physiologically down regulated from both a muscle protein synthetic response perspective, nor from an energy availability perspective. I mean, so many different implications being an energy deficit, but just even a slight surplus, you can maximize muscle growth. You can sufficiently fuel your training. And if you pair that and you periodize things in a manner where you're engaging in progressive resistance training and subsequently increasing your calories as those metabolic adaptations are incurred, and you're making sure you're in a net surplus, whether that be 100-calorie surplus or not, whatever it may be, just see body weight gain go over time. So, Eric, if you have time for one more question, I would love to really extrapolate this out in terms of, I would love for us to cover essentially how to apply these research findings in the real world and how we can go about tracking muscle gain progress outside of the lab. Because, most of the
Mhm.
listeners out here aren't going to have skin fold thickness or biopsy or any of those things. And
Right.
what we have to realize, and I know you're great at getting this across as both a scientist and a science communicator, is that research doesn't provide us a protocol to use with ourselves or with our clients. It provides us information to guide our decisions. So I'd love to hear how you would recommend going about tracking muscle gain progress in the real world, because it is going to be a slow process. And maybe we can look towards certain metrics, whether that be training performance or different things that you look at body weight going up over time. And then also, I look at it more from a habitual perspective because, Eric, you and I are pretty long into this game. And so at this point, it's like it's really hard to track certain of these metrics besides training performance and body weight. But it's like it really comes down to the habits and trusting in that process and being patient with it.
Yeah, and this is actually another finding that we discussed in the discussion, ironically, not at all, is that part of the reason the regression was useful is because we saw the same amount of average weight gain in the moderate and the large surplus group. And that is telling. So we actually gave a prescription of a 5% or a 15% surplus, and then basically back calculated that as how much weight gain should we see on average and the change from, the 2 week averages, right? So what that essentially tells you is that the average person is going to struggle to differentiate between a 5 to 15% surplus. So it might make sense on paper to have an advanced lifter be in a 100 calorie surplus, but that's probably going to turn into something between maintenance and a 200 or 300 calorie surplus realistically, right? Probably skewed upward. Not everyone. There's some more restrained eaters out there who might be, in an even smaller surplus than you intend. So is that a realistic guidance to give people? And are there downsides to giving someone a target and then them constantly overshooting it or struggling to hit it and feeling like that hit to self-efficacy? So I would argue that unless you're working with a population that is really, really good at being incredibly precise, and this is probably, the study design is probably impacted by my bias as a bodybuilder and a bodybuilding coach. I have no problem doing a 5% surplus or 15% surplus, and neither do my competitive clients or our competitive clients more broadly at 3D Muscle Journey. But that's not a accurate representation of the typical person who is going to benefit from reading this study. So to nutrition coaches who are working with non-competitors who are interested in muscle gain, I think it's not unreasonable at all to go, right, okay, this person would probably do better with a 100 calorie surplus, but I'm going to give them a 200 to 400 calorie surplus, and then we'll just set an appropriate schedule of diet, of mini cuts to mitigate the fat gain that may or may not come with that. I think that's one thing that is related to your question. That is also a finding that you could say from our study, or at least something that is implied based upon the not really being a group differentiation there. And obviously, you can deal with that on an individual basis. If the person is clearly gaining weight too quickly, and you can guide them and coach them on how to make that energy intake a little more consistent and a little bit smaller, fantastic. But if you kind of know that, there's a certain threshold of surplus that they're going to be in no matter what, or there's too much variation around the mean and you don't want them dipping into a deficit too often, it might be better in terms of at least mental stress and feeling like they're actually doing what's being coached rather than being asked to hit a target that's too precise for their skill set or just their metabolic adaptation, right? To put them in a slightly larger surplus and then just deal with it down the road. Maybe you wanted to do a 6 month gaining phase, but you get 3 months. and then you do a 2 to 3 week cleanup, I think that's probably fine either way. So that's a piece of information. Um, the primary metrics I think you're looking at when you don't have access to getting, an ISAC quality skin fold or muscle thickness on a regular basis, um, people would probably want me to tell them, hey, you should do some tape measures. And I think that's okay, but you really need to make sure that throwing the tape measure on your arm and your waist and your quad is put into the right context and that you have sufficient reliability.
Mhm.
Like if you want to try this, like right now, get a tape measure, measure your arm 3 times in a row, or measure your leg and measure your waist, and see how much disparity there is just in those three measurements. Most people, the first time they do this, they're going to be potentially off by inches, and that really makes it and too unreliable to know what's a real change. So you can do that, but what you want to do first is just get really good at measuring yourself until you're seeing, you know, less than half an inch disparity. And then you think, okay, well, when would I expect whatever my error is to make more gains than that? So let's say you do 3 measurements on your arm and you take the average, and those measurements are within a quarter inch of each other. That's pretty good, right? Okay, how long until you're going to put a quarter inch on your arm? You
A
think,
very
oh,
long
I don't know.
time.
Right. So that means how often would you do these measurements on your arms specifically? And if you are seeing change, what is it most likely? It's probably body fat, right? So you can do waist measurements a little more frequently because you're going to gain body fat quickly. And if that's staying stable and everything else is going up, that's a useful use. But, giving the listener that context of understanding, like, doing a bunch of body measurements to measure actual hypertrophy changes, you probably need to be doing that every 3 months. But what you can track and what will be changing on a regular basis and what does give you useful feedback is your training progress and your body weight. So I like to operate kind of off of a moving 2 week average. So it's, your current weight compared to the average of the last 14 days. I have a spreadsheet that I use a lot of my clients. It gives the week average. I have the daily one, of course, the week average, 2 week average, and then a running 2 week average averaged on the current day. Another great one, if you don't want to create a spreadsheet, is Happy Scale,
Mhm.
which you can use for free. And that kind of gives you this running 10-day average and it smooths the data and it tells you your weight based upon all the data that's put in. And I find that is really helpful for people to get an idea of what their body weight's actually doing. And they don't get too caught up if they're looking at like the predicted what we think your weight is currently, the high swing or the low swing, because you might be 2 pounds up on a given day and 2 pounds lower. But the actual body weight is fluctuating for things unrelated to the thing you care about. It's not muscle mass or fat mass changing 2 pounds in a day. So looking at good versions of changes in body mass and to clean up that noise, not only is math helpful, but also the methods you use to assess it. So getting up first thing in the morning at a similar time of morning with a similar meal schedule, eating at the same time, sleeping the same amount, so having a pretty consistent lifestyle, stepping on the scale after you use the toilet, before you drink water or eat any food, nude, on a hard surface on a reliable scale that has not old batteries, and then writing that down daily and getting an average is going to be far more reliable than going to the gym, having gotten a sick arm pump and being like, I bet I'm bigger right now, and in your sweaty, baggy, sweatshirt, stepping on the scale at, 24 Hour Fitness, and then, California Family Fitness the next week and comparing those two, right? And just having one measurement. That's going to be not just not helpful, it'll be counterproductive because it'll give you bad data. So that's the way you would want to collect that data. That's the way you'd want to compare it. And then I think, given that we've established the principal thing that you're trying to create to have a successful bulk is a good training program that you're going to support with nutrition, looking at your training progress over time is critical. This is not necessarily 1RMs. This is just, hey, is my performance clustering upward? If I'm doing 3 sets of 10 on the hammer strength incline, am I able to make those sets of 10 with slightly heavier loads, or are they becoming sets of 11 or 12, whatever progression paradigm you're using? You do want to see a relatively steady but appropriate paced progress for your level of experience. And if that's occurring, you know that overload's occurring.
Mhm.
So I think that ultimately tells you, is your training doing its job? Now, just because in our study, the 1RM change in squat and bench press wasn't related to muscle mass gain or weight gain at all, doesn't mean that you can't use performance changes, because there's a lot that goes into a skilled 1RM and training for it. I'm not saying you should become a power lifter, but you If you are adapting to your training, you should be able to see your total number of reps you can get over 3 sets on a row slowly increasing over time. So if that's not occurring and you're gaining weight, that's probably not going to go well in most cases. So what you want to look for is uh, the slowest weight gain you can get while still tracking a reasonable size surplus. Obviously, if you're a total noob, you can go much faster. But for the audience we're probably talking to, what's a reasonable surplus that you can track and be consistently not in a deficit? Mini cutting once that gets out of hand. Every few months, checking some reliable uh, circumferences to see how that's going. Pictures, obviously looking in the mirror, but also a similar amount of distance of time. You want multiple months before you're assessing what you visually look like. And then primarily focusing on, am I progressing in the gym while I'm in this small surplus?
Absolutely. And Eric, when it comes to actual progression across movements, do you think that it'd be more conducive to look at single joint isolation movements over your compounds due to the neural components of compound movements? So, for instance, a lot of times I'll specifically be looking, obviously, I want to see things going up across time. And within particular exercises, I want to see my client's volume load going up over time. So,
Mm.
same rep set amount of sets. So, if they're doing 3 sets and it's in a rep range of 8 to 12, I want to see either that the reps are going up over time or load the ability, the load that they're using with an exercise is going up. But when we're specifically doing, say, a specialization cycle, so we're looking to bring up their delts or their biceps or their arms or their glutes, I want to see the isolation movements for those muscle groups going up over time rather than a barbell back squat, where there could be some technical proficiency that they're getting better at, or just some neural adaptations that could be driving some of those strength progressions. So, is that something you incorporate as well?
Yeah, I think you could absolutely, like theoretically, that makes sense, right? The more a movement can improve in terms of performance due to changes in skill, then the less sensitive that's going to be to potentially being able to produce more force just because you have more contractile tissue. So theoretically, yeah, if your like lateral raise machine is going up and you're not changing your technique and you're pausing at the bottom, full stretch, getting as high as you can, and you have a consistent range of motion, and you're doing 11 reps to failure, and a month ago you were doing 9, that's probably a good thing. But yeah, like obviously your 1RM can go up 300 pounds in a period of complete detraining to training. Maybe not 300 pounds. That's an exaggeration. But I would absolutely say that my 1RM on squats, as someone who squats 500 pounds, could go up 120 pounds over a 12-week period without me putting on any muscle mass.
And even
So
some of Lenneke's data shows that as well. There's
yes,
not a direct
yes,
link between actual increases in strength and increases in muscle.
yes,
So,
especially on maximal strength on a skilled movement over the short term. Like I think that doesn't mean that strength and hypertrophy aren't related. It just means that there are some big buckets under the umbrella of strength that are not hypertrophy. Um, but once you get into movements, once you get into like how much work did I do on a bicep curl over 3 sets with consistent form, when I'm comparing my daily training logs over 3 months, that's probably a little different. And it's at least one of the factors contributing to why you can do more reps. And even more so, you can't neurally adapt forever into infinity. We're not just a nervous system floating around on like electrical impulses and eyeballs connected to a brain. There we have a skeletal system and a muscular system for a reason. And as we get better and better at neural adaptations, we are exposing our body to higher loads and higher levels of tension. And you will typically see that while neurological gains have higher magnitude of change, they occur concurrently, at least over long enough time periods, with tissue changes in lean mass. And when they're not occurring, when you're seeing no changes in strength, then there's probably not going to be a change in what's happening at the tissue level because the exposure to those tissues is the same, right? So and this is probably why when you look at cross-sectional analyses of any type of strength athlete, this has been done in strongmen, powerlifters, Olympic weightlifters. What differentiates like elite level powerlifters, those who have higher muscle thickness, it explains like 80% of the variance of where they're placing, because ultimately that's the raw tissue. And when you homogenize everybody, the high level powerlifters, great technique, been training for years, knows how to bench, knows how to squat, maxed out their technique. These are true masters of their craft. The person with bigger pecs is probably going to bench more.
Absolutely. Form follows function. So a bigger muscle is capable of more force, essentially.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, Eric, thank you so much for coming back on the show. I want to give you an opportunity to plug everything that you're involved in. This was a great analysis of your study. I really appreciate you coming on. And like I alluded to earlier, I did hear a lot of people jumping on when you had the preprint. I actually had some individuals, I've been on doing the podcast circuit and stuff, and they had asked me to speak on it. And I always wait for the head author to speak on a paper first. So once you had actually released the fully published, copy, then I did speak about it on podcast. So I was well versed with it. But at the same time, I really do enjoy the ability to speak with the person that is either a contributor or the head author on a paper, so that we can dispel some of like the myths or some of like the hot takes that come out on social media on a reel or on a Twitter thread, and we're really able to get to the root of the actual findings, as well as what you guys found, as well as the limitations within the study. So I really do thank you for coming on and really just getting in the nitty gritty of your research study.
Well, I can't tell you how much I appreciate the platform to do so, and how critical it is to have these types of discussions. And I do encourage people to, to share their hot takes, because it at least creates conversations. It's a new set of problems, but it's a set of problems I much prefer. The ability to go on with GVS on his YouTube and talk for an hour about his take on the paper and what he might have got wrong. It's far better than when people just didn't even know there were studies, or they would be immediately dismissed as pencil necks. So yeah, there's a lot of information out there. Science is hard to interpret, and sometimes it's confusing, and people take it in ways that maybe aren't fully accurate based on the data, but those do generate opportunities for us to discuss. So I'm really pleased for it. So thank you.
Absolutely,
Um,
my friend.
as far as plugging my stuff, I think, you mentioned mass. If you're the type of person who listened this long into this episode, that's probably where you want to go, is massresearchreview.com, where we do study breakdowns on a monthly basis on all kinds of topics like this. If you're interested in kind of the cohesive connection between all those things and what do we do with that, muscleandstrengthpyramids.com. Those are my books on nutrition and training. And if you're like, screw that, I don't want to try to do this myself, it's too complex, give me some coaching. I am the chief science officer of 3dmusclejourney.com, where our coaches work with all levels of lifters interested in building muscle mass or strength drug free. And we'd be more than happy to help you. You can go and check that out, and you can be confident they're working with the best up to date practices, because it's part of my job to make sure that they do. So those are the three places I'd recommend people to go. And if you want to hear me promoting the podcast I've been on, I'll probably be making a collaboration post on this with Brandon on my Instagram at Helms 3DMJ, and you can keep up with all the stuff that I do outside of my own hosted platforms, which is always a pleasure and a privilege.
Awesome. Yet again, Eric, thank you so much. And guys, we will be back next week. Peace.